Cables on the 2021 DAVEGA kits come without the Gst housing installed on the speed controller side. This has two advantages. First, you don't need to commit to a specific speed controller at the time of purchase. Second, if you are running the cable through a hole in your deck or your enclosure, if you do that before putting the Gst housing on, you can keep the holes smaller. First, let's talk about the communication ports on the VESC-based controllers, since that's where the DAVEGA plugs into. Most of the electric skateboard speed controllers on the market are derived either from the VESC 4 or the VESC 6 design. The VESC 6 based controllers typically have an 8-pin communication port with 5 volts, 3.3 volts, ground, ADC1, RX, TX, ADC2 and ADC3. The VESC 4 based controllers typically have a 7-pin communication port with 5 volts, 3.3 volts, ground, ADC1, RX, TX and ADC2. The pinouts on the two are very similar. The difference is that the VESC 6 has an extra pin and the RX and TX pins are reversed. Note that while these two pinouts are the most common, other pinouts do exist. This Maker X controller is one example. So please be aware of this and always check the pin labels on your speed controller's communication port or look up the pinout online. DAVEGA connects to the 3.3 volt, ground, RX and TX pins. Each DAVEGA pin connects to the equally labeled speed controller pin. Note that the 3.3 volts pin is sometimes also labeled VCC. The VESC 6 type communication port used to require crossing the RX and TX wires. However, starting from firmware version 4.4, DAVEGA tolerates swapping the RX and TX pins, so it's no longer necessary to cross the wires. If you make a mistake on setting up your cable, in most cases you will be able to correct it. However, there's one exception. DAVEGA is a 3.3 volt device, and if you connect any of its pins to the 5 volt output, it will very likely damage it beyond repair. Please keep this in mind, and when plugging the cable into the speed controller communication port, double check that no wire is going to the 5 volt pin. Here is what the correctly set up cable typically looks like for both the VESC 4 and VESC 6 based controller types. Let me just quickly mention that the 7-pin setup will work for both the Fogbox Unity and the BKB Zenith. I mention this because these controllers are widely used and come without the pin labels on the communication port. Next, let's talk about the Gst Crimps and Housings. The crimps have little fins. If inserted correctly, the fin sits behind a retainer which prevents the crimp from coming out of the housing. This picture shows 3 correctly inserted crimps. The last crimp, however, is not all the way in and the fin is not sitting behind the retainer. It would be easy to pull it out of the housing. One wire on every cable is marked with white lines. This is the 3.3 volt wire. Hold the cable with the labeled wire on the left and double check that the fins are facing down. The openings on the Gst housing must also be facing down. To insert a wire, hold it right behind the crimp and push it in until you hear a click. This can usually be done with bare hands, but if you have trouble getting the crimp in, you can also use tweezers. Again, hold the wire right behind the crimp and push it in. Gently pull on each wire to make sure it won't come out. This Gst housing wasn't new and you can see that one of the wires came out. That's because the retainer was left in the open position. I pushed the wire back in and forced all the retainers into the closed position by pushing on them with my thumbnail. Now the wire can no longer be pulled out. To remove a wire from the housing, you'll need a small screwdriver, a needle or a pin. Carefully lift the retainer and gently pull the wire out. Do not force it. It must come out easily, otherwise you may damage the fin on the crimp. If you plan to reuse the housing, push all the retainers back